First, I get why you can't stand communism, Steph, because of dictatorship. But what's wrong with socialism? You literally said that you were a socialist during your youth. What turned you away from it? I suppose it wasn't liberalism, so what was it? Second, what's wrong with ideology? Well, I was a socialist during my youth, before I got any particular education in philosophy, political science, public choice theory, Austrian economics, objectivism, rationalism, plain old empirical thinking. And actually, if you go back further than when I was in my early teens, you can actually find me believing in things like the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and so on. These are fantasies designed to be outgrown. So what turned me away from it was moving out of the realm of feels and into the realm of thinks. And that is, of course, the big challenge. Socialism is a child's view of deficiency, right? Some people are wealthy and some people are poor. It's like that picture you see of the guy living in a cardboard box. And behind him are the giant towers of some financial building. And the idea, of course, is like if you have a kid with no ice cream and a kid with 2 scoops of ice cream, you take 1 scoop of ice cream from the kid with 2 and you give it to the one with none, and lo and behold, everyone has ice cream. There's a line in King Lear that distribution should undo excess and each man have enough. It is an age-old fantasy that the redistribution of wealth smooths out the problem, so the disparities in income, and you can make the poor richer by taking from the rich and giving to the poor. It views society as children that don't act in their own self-interest, and it is a parent's view of a disparity between children. Like it or not, who we are and what we get as adults, outside some brain damage or some physical disability, are largely the result of choices that we make. We don't all start at the same place on the starting line, but where we end up has a lot more to do with how hard we work and how much we're willing to take self-criticism and how much we're willing to work with others and compromise and intelligently allocate our life's resources. Poor households in America, you've got 2-parent households or 2-people households, which work an average of 10 or so hours a week. So people can choose to work less, and the result of that is that they have less money. People can choose to work harder, and as a result, they generally have more money. Now, it's true that there are idiots who are born into money, and the market does a very good job of separating idiots from their money, right? There's an old statement or saying that used to be made back before the government controlled most of the economy, and it was shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And that means, shirt sleeves is a manual laborer. Some guy works really hard, gets out of manual labor, becomes an office worker or a business manager or some sort of magnate. And then his kids don't inherit his abilities, his IQ, his work ethic, whatever. Maybe he's a bad parent because he's working too much. And what happens is the kids then end up going back to shirt sleeves again. Here, there was a store, really an empire that had been going on forever, decades and decades and decades, over 100 years, I think, called Eaton's. And I think there were 4 sons, and Eaton's is wiped off the map because they invested badly. They thought it'd be really smart to have no sales, everyday low prices, no sales. And so they went against the grain of retailing, which is to lure people in with sales and then upsell them to other things. And the company was bought out. It is no more. And so that, if you don't like the rich, just wait a bit. They're probably not going to stay rich. Now, that's before rich people could invest in the power of the government to protect them from competition. And this is foundational. If you want to reduce wealth disparities and reduce the aggregation of unearned income, what you need to do is reduce or eliminate the power of the state to control the economy. It's very hard for rich people to compete with poor people because poor people have a much lower standard of living. So when I first was an entrepreneur, I was living in a room. It was me, 4 gay guys, a lesbian, and lots of work. My rent was $270 a month, all in. And kind of tough for somebody who has to pay $5,000 a month in his mortgage to compete with me. So I had low income because I was broke, just got out of grad school, and I didn't have a car. And so I was able to work really hard, really cheap. So the best way to deal with income disparities is just wait and let the free market reward the hardworking and reward the diligent and reward the honorable and the virtuous and take resources away from those who are lazy or bad or combative uselessly and so on. So you just start to think about it, and you recognize, of course, that any agency that you create to redistribute income that's called a government is going to have to do it by force, right? So it's going to have to redistribute that income by force. Now, once you create an agency in society that has the power to redistribute income by force, well, who is it going to respond to more, the rich or the poor, right? So what it's going to do is it's going to want to create, it's not conscious, it's just the way the system works out, right? I mean, each little cigarette can make you sick. You're not smoking cigarettes in order to get sick. It's just an inevitable byproduct of the habit. And the habit called the state, its goal, of course, is to create reliable repeat voters. And the way that it does that is it creates a dependent class. And once you create a dependent class, then that group of people are going to vote for you and are going to vote for your policies and so on, which is why nobody talks about really fundamentally cutting any entitlement programs, because the government has bred those people and crushed them under the seeming generosity of the welfare state to be passive drip morphine recipients with the endless ache called no lives, requiring the state to continue. And for the rich, what you do is you create, you threaten them with rules that go against their interest, and then you either withdraw those rules if they donate enough money, which is kind of like a shakedown, or what you do is you create rules and then you charge people for exemptions and exceptions to those rules. And you can see this with Obamacare exemptions being handed out to friends of politicians, particularly out on the West Coast. And you create, you gather together all this money, and then you start pushing green initiatives, which makes people feel good and gives you money to hand out and to invest in and so on. It's just basically bribes for votes and so on. And so the problem is, if you want to redistribute income, you have to create an agency that enslaves the poor and serves the rich. And there's no way that you could ever conceivably, possibly in any way, shape, or form, not have that be the outcome of whatever system you're putting in place. You create a giant agency with the massive power to redistribute billions or trillions of dollars at will. Of course that agency is going to get corrupted. Of course it is. I mean, this power corrupts, and the welfare state is a truly stupendous amount of power. The other thing, of course, is that the government doesn't have the knowledge, the in-depth local community knowledge, to differentiate between the deserving and the undeserving poor, right? So if you subsidize the undeserving poor, in other words, people who are poor because they've made really bad decisions and they have done things that you don't want to support, right? In other words, the poor whose choices have led them to poverty. Those people you don't want to subsidize. You want to help them, particularly if they have kids, but you don't want to just keep funneling money at them so that they can go and, buy smokes and drinks and go to the racetrack and do internet betting or whatever it is that's causing them to remain poor or just not go to work. So you don't want to subsidize that kind of poor person. But at the same time, if somebody is poor accidentally, it's just something happened or whatever, then you do want to help those people, because helping those people, it's not going to cause a repetition of the behavior. In the same way, knowing who to sentence to jail and who to sentence to probation, these requires very detailed and local knowledge. Now, given the tens or sometimes hundreds of millions of people on the receiving end of government assistance, there's no way for the government to know who is deserving of charity and who will charity make worse, right? Charity is an incredibly complicated system and situation to set up. I mean, I know I do some charitable stuff through this show. It's really, really tough to figure out who should get your money, at what level will it help them, at what too much level will it hurt them, are you subsidizing bad habits or encouraging good habits? It's one of the most complicated things in the world to do, is to help another human being, which is kind of why I suggest everyone can go to therapy who've got problems when they call into this show. And there's no way the government can know who is the deserving poor and who is the undeserving poor, particularly because the undeserving poor want to portray themselves as the deserving poor, right, in order to get resources. So there's simply no way to create this massive, well-armed entity called the state, give it the power to forcibly create, print, produce, borrow, steal, pay, bribe money from millions of people, and just not have that go haywire, and not have the rich take it over and the poor become dependent on it over time. So this is a very, very brief overview of my thinking on the subject. And of course, I saw a lot of people when I grew up in a very poor neighborhood. And I saw the change. Like, I mean, this may be too personal, but I mean, these are, how did I change? Well, when I was very young, there was I lived in a section of London, England, near Crystal Palace. And I lived in a little apartment, and there was a bunch of other apartment buildings. And then in the back of the whole area were these like really dingy row houses. And in those row houses were the people who didn't work. And it was like auditions for idiocracy. They, wife beaters and, lager in the afternoon and smokes and kids running around. Grimy and all that, and it was like this row, and in the beginning when I was a little kid, that was like, ooh, those people, they're right, not good. It's not a good situation, and it was considered shameful to be on the dole. It was considered to be like, whoa, you have really, really messed up in your life if you end up having to take government assistance. And this was, I guess, shortly after. This was in the, I guess, early to mid 70s, so not too long after the big welfare state came in for most countries in the 60s. Now, I left England. Well, my family left England. I deigned to come along. I left England when I was 11. And by that time, from sort of the age of 6 or 7 to 10 or 11, not that long, half a decade or less, everything had changed. Everything had changed. And now you couldn't say anything negative about the people. They were the downtrodden. They were the poor. They needed help and sympathy. There was no negative judgment about it. And it's one fundamental thing about society that when we lose the ability to criticize each other, we invite the state in as a brutal arbiter. And that is something that I kind of noticed. It's like, what happened to these people being bad and now they're totally fine? And that's what effect this has when you get government money coming in. You fundamentally change people's incentives. You fundamentally change people's value judgments. And it becomes a very difficult thing to recover from. So these are just a few of the ideas. And what's wrong with socialism? It's never stable. Socialism is the redistribution of wealth through the agency of the state. It's never stable. It's never stable because power tends to grow. And not economic power. Economic power tends to grow and then diminish, right? So of the 100 companies that were around at the turn of the 20th century, like in the 1900s, only 5 or so are still around today. And that's even with the power of the state to stave off competition from the poor. Economic power tends to be highly unstable, and comes and goes, rises and falls. Hey, I'm king of the buggy manufacturers. Is that a car I hear? Right? We just can, hey, look, I've just perfected the rotary dial phone. Hey, what's that push button? Right? So there's always this creative destruction of the market that overturns existing oligarchies. I mean, when I was a kid, the phone companies were like giant orgasmatrons of collective power, economically speaking, and now they've either divested or broken up or gone bankrupt. And so things are constantly changing. But political power tends to increase always. So you can't have a stable socialism. You can't have a socialism where we say, aha, we've reached the optimum amount of redistribution. There's not going to be any more corruption. We're not going to print or borrow money or anything like that. That never happens, which is why these debts continually increase.